Today I'm in conversation with Dom Holmes. Dom is a partner at law firm Taylor Vinters, specialising in employment law. And we're going to be talking about some of the practical issues and the legal issues associated with navigating the immediate impact of the coronavirus crisis, and specifically what employers should be thinking about when dealing with some of those challenges. And we'll be touching on some of the legal topics. What can you actually do from the perspective of changing the way people work, changing their working pattern and changing their terms, but also some of the practical challenges. How do you maintain open and transparent communication with staff during this period of change, and how do you make sure that you get the best out of the relationship that you've nurtured?
So hi everyone, my name's Dom Holmes. I'm partner and co-head of the employment team at Taylor Vinters.
And I'm Matt Meyer, Chief Exec of Taylor Vinters. And we thought we'd bring this podcast to you today because we're very conscious that many of you are dealing with the challenges of the current COVID-19 crisis, and lots of the questions that are being asked of our teams back in the office or in the home office, as is more the case now, are very similar. And very keen to make sure that we can share as much of our experience across as wider audience as possible. And I guess, Dom, one of the key things that you're getting asked is, what's everyone else doing?
Yeah, absolutely, Matt. And things are obviously changing so quickly. So my standard answer to that question is, well, they're doing what you're doing, which is trying to work through the government guidance, seeking advice where appropriate. But really, I think for businesses who are managing this, whatever their current financial situation or their business planning situation is, there's obviously the short term, which is what happens if we have to shut down the office? What happens if people go off sick? What happens if people have to stay at home and look after children because the nurseries and schools have just shut? And then there's the longer term contingency planning. So, how long can we go on our current business model and our current cost base, assuming that our revenues are going to be impacted in the short term? And how do we address that? Do we do stuff immediately to try and reduce our people costs, for example, or the amount of time our people are in the business? Do we just hold our nerve and sit tight? And that's very kind of sector specific and very business specific, I think.
And I think when I talk to leaders of other businesses, one of the key leadership challenges at the moment is how do we operate both at a practical level and in our own heads on those three different tracks at the same time. And there's clearly a pressing need to do that. So hopefully in this conversation, what we can do is talk a little bit about what everyone's doing with the aim of either sharing best practice or making sure that we're all making the same mistakes.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Excellent. So, I mean, clearly it's although we've seen this coming for some time, and we've had the experience of what's been happening in other countries, my sense is it still feels like a bit of a shock to most management teams. What is the mood music? How are people feeling in the teams that you're advising?
There is a sense of shock, a sense that perhaps the government guidance has been a little bit slow and a little bit woolly at times, and we're coming up against a situation where we've gone very, very quickly from a situation where it was effectively business as usual, save for certain people who might have to self-isolate because they were worried about their symptoms. And that there's a real flip, at the start of this week where the government started saying, well, everyone should work from home if it is possible to do that. And that's a real kind of immediate mindset change. So sort of business management teams are having to pivot really, really quickly to adjust to that new world. Some are better prepared than others. So some have workforces who can largely work from home. They're already set up to do that, so they have the tech in place. Others have been sort of floundering a little bit and working out, well, which roles can usefully be done from home? Which ones could be done from home but can't be at the moment simply because we're not in a position to offer it? And which people definitely need to come in because of their role or their position in the business? So whole range of questions on those lines.
I think what was fascinating as the government guidance started to crystallise and harden up a little bit was the realisation that actually many businesses had got ahead of the government's advice. They'd taken their own view, and they weren't dependent on a centralised government view. They'd taken a view based on their ability. This is as I see it. Certainly, their ability to maintain control of their organisations, because clearly there was a a growing level of anxiety in the workforce.
Yeah.
But also their need to make sure that their workforce was not taken out in one medical hit.
Yeah.
They actually, although the government was keen to delay, actually many businesses wanted to make sure that there was as much isolation as possible, so that the risk of multiple people being off sick at the same time was spread. Did that surprise you?
I don't think it did, because I think ultimately, as with any kind of unplanned business scenario, I think it's the businesses who are proactive and trying to stay ahead of things that tend to do the best. And we've been talking to organisations who have done that and are already in a really good position, and who are already, for example, having discussions with their staff about childcare if schools and nurseries shut. Because, if you think back 2 days ago, the government was saying, yes, we might need to do it, but not for several weeks. And then we fast forward to Wednesday evening, and all of a sudden they're shutting within 48 hours. So that the businesses who are now being reactive to all of that are understandably, I think, in a little bit more of a immediate period of chaos while they actually work out what they need to do. So
absolutely, I mean, it's probably worth just clarifying for listeners when we're recording this podcast on Thursday the 19th of March, very much in the eye of the storm, and I suspect whenever you're listening to this, there'll be a similar versions of that same fast-paced environment. From a legal perspective, the government guidance is just guidance. It's not a directive. Is there any risk to employers not following the government guidance?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, Matt, and one we've had a couple of times saying, well, this is effectively advisory, and actually we'd much rather people stayed at work as long as they possibly can. My instinct tells me that though those businesses are in the minority now, the default position for most organisations I'm talking to are, yes, let's get people working from home if we haven't done it already, and it's possible to do so. And I think just from a pure legal perspective, if you're going to start departing from government guidance, bearing in mind that employers have an overriding duty of care to manage their employees, in accordance with health and safety, you need to have a pretty good business reason for doing it, which would override that guidance, which is being backed by bang up to date science.
It's probably worth clarifying, and again, very conscious we are in the eye of the storm of this crisis. But what is the government guidance as at today?
So, government guidance as at today is, as we've been discussing, where people can work from home, if it's possible to do so, they should do so. They should avoid all unnecessary travel. So, both on a personal and a business level, and I think employers have some real decisions to make there, particularly our multinational corporations. And bearing in mind, actually, that for businesses who operate across multiple jurisdictions, they're going to have to have been dealing with this kind of issue, in Europe and Asia already, and the US to an extent. So it's kind of it may be simply a question of extending what they're already doing to how they operate in the UK. And the last sort of key component of that is where people are coming into the office, there is still a duty to look after them as there would be for anywhere else. So it's about social distancing and taking appropriate hygiene measures. We've had clients who are staggering start times and staggering rest breaks within the organisation to ensure that they minimise the risk of people sort of gathering together in sort of breakout areas or in the canteen. So all sorts of measures like that, and absolutely keeping sort of in-person meetings to a minimum. So I've probably had more video calls in the last 2 days than I've had in the last 2 years. That's indicative of how employers are treating it.
Absolutely, and we'll talk about the opportunities later. But I've definitely spoken to more of my colleagues and seen more of my colleagues than I would on an average week. So every cloud has a silver lining.
Indeed.
In terms of businesses applying that guidance, those rules, are you seeing businesses segment different categories of staff? I mean, there's an interesting debate about who's the most vulnerable and who's not, but is it more complicated than that?
I think it's very business specific, Matt. So obviously the immediate concern is to deal with employees who may have exhibited symptoms and are self-isolating, whether that's because the employer has asked them to, or because they've taken it upon themselves to do that. And then there's also issues around employers who know of employees who are within those vulnerable categories, who have underlying health conditions, which, perhaps have not widely been spoken about within the organisation, but now need to be addressed quite quickly for their own safety.
And in addressing some of those issues where people do have underlying health conditions, I know that many of our clients have had one eye on GDPR to make sure that they don't, in making their best efforts to do the right thing, fall foul of regulation. Is that a live issue now?
Yeah, I think so. And the GDPR is obviously pretty comprehensive legislation, and with the protection of sensitive, what we call now special categories of personal data, so including health data being absolutely paramount. So most employers still rightly being cautious, but and engaging with the individuals who may have those health conditions first to explain why they might need to disclose, either on an anonymous or even perhaps a named basis, depending on the circumstances, that someone needs to be away for a particular reason.
Yeah, it's definitely a time to be pragmatic.
Yeah.
But it's also worth having a broad perspective on what the potential issues might be. And as
Indeed.
you say, dealing with, talking to, and being sensitive with the individuals concerned has got to be the pragmatic starting point.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
So I want to come back to what happens in the home working environment, because the world is alive. LinkedIn is alive with conversation about how to make all that work for what might be or increasingly looks like a long period of time. But just sticking with the office environment at the moment, and let's start at the front door. You have still got your office open for whatever reason. It may be because you're in a business where you need to deal with frontline customers or suppliers. It may be because the type of work that you do isn't easily facilitated in a home working environment. And we as a business, for example, have a lot of clients who are in the technology and engineering space where you literally can't take the lab home. So there is a skeleton staff in place. People are coming into the building. What's the deal if they want to take temperature checks? There's a real world question.
Yeah.
It's coming up all the time.
Yeah.
What do businesses do?
So interesting. I've had a couple of conversations on this over the past couple of days, Matt, and the answer, as far as I'm concerned, as far as the law is concerned, is, broadly speaking, taking temperature checks is okay. The discussions I've been having about clients is making sure they're clear on why they're doing it, signposting it appropriately. So in the same way you might say, CCTV is in operation here, you probably have a sign on your reception desk saying, we're taking temperature checks, here's why we're doing it. From a regulatory perspective, again, taking that kind of data is sensitive. It's special category of data, so you need a legitimate interest to do it, which broadly speaking you have, and then you need a second reason. So that in broad terms is public health. It's stuff that's in the public interest. So broadly speaking, it is possible to sort of take temperature checks, and ultimately people still have the choice as to whether they say yes or no to that. And if they say no, our advice has been, for the safety of others in the building, you should be asking them to leave the premises.
Okay, and you can do that.
Yeah, I don't see any issue with that.
Fantastic. And I guess the other concern is lots of people are in multi-occupancy buildings. How much visibility should we be giving staff about how other subtenants in the same building are operating? Is that something that's realistic and practical, or is it just a bridge too far in this situation?
Again, I think that depends on how, on practical stuff like how that building is configured. So if you have a sort of central reception area that everyone has to pass through, and you have certain, subtenants, for example, who say, I don't want to comply with that temperature check policy, we think that's a bridge too far. Yeah, and ultimately they've got people in the building who have not been checked in the same way as others. I think the starting point for businesses is they just need to look after their own employees as best they can, and whether that means, for example, including additional measures to minimise the contact they might have with employees of tenants who haven't been checked. That might be something they might consider.
Yeah. Okay. And I think one of the positive things we are seeing is that people are being much more cooperative and sensible than they might otherwise be. And it's all good indication of human nature is still alive and well and positive.
Yeah, and we'll probably come on to this later, Matt. But then that ranges from the full range, from the full scope of things, from practical stuff like temperature checks and getting into the building, to sort of longer term measures around people perhaps having to reduce their working hours, and people feeling like they are all in it together. And I think employers are possibly going to meet less resistance than they might anticipate to those short-term measures.
Yeah, I definitely want to talk about that later, because I think there's a real challenge, and I don't say that in a negative way, but there is a real challenge around organisations that have put culture and purpose and human and social interrelationships at the core of their people strategy. And I think when we talk about what next, that's an interesting area to look at. So at the moment, we're back at the front door. You've come through. You've had your temperature checked. Whoever's taking temperature hasn't stepped back a metre and ushered you out of the revolving door. You're into the building. How do we apply these social distancing guidance rules in the real world in an office environment?
Well, I think we take them as literally as we possibly can. So for many organisations, they might find that they do have a skeleton staff in place, so it won't be the office will not be as busy as usual. So if we're thinking about the government guidance to try and stay 2 meters apart from each other, it might require some desk moves, for example. So if you've got a particular team that all sit together in a pod, and there's a load of space in the building now that's being underutilized, then you spread people out a bit more. Practical stuff like you have greater hygiene measures, cleaning the building more often, maybe changing the cleaning products that your cleaners use, so they're more alcohol based, for example. So simple stuff like that. Hand sanitizers, discouraging any form of meeting that cannot be done remotely or virtually, and which is pretty much every meeting, I think. Even if you have to have a confidential conversation with someone, there is scope for both of you to be in a private area where you're not going to be disturbed or disclose anything sensitive. So it's common sense stuff like that, I would say. It's
common sense, and I think it's also becoming just a much more acceptable and common conversation. Everybody knows what's happening. There's no embarrassment around that, and as the days and weeks go on, I'm sure that will only get easier. And that's a really interesting point, Matt, because if I sort of think back maybe a couple of weeks ago where we were still going out and meeting clients and having lunches with them, there was a kind of awkward, should we be shaking hands? Should we be bumping elbows? And now people are completely okay with that kind of thing. It's completely socially acceptable. Yeah, just a nod and a smile. It's all good. Okay, so social distancing, common sense. Yeah, absolutely. What's been interesting, I think, talking to a number of businesses over the last couple of weeks is how the rationale for applying those social distancing rules has been partly about common sense, partly about complying with the guidance, but also about protecting operational capability. Because one of the things that's become very clear is that there are people that need to be part of that core or skeleton staff, typically in offices that are being kept open. Yeah. And really coming back to your duty of care point, the duty of care is to make sure that they are as protected as possible. And that's a commercial necessity, not least because the reason they're in the core staff is because we need them. So, I think businesses are very much looking at the dual channels of protecting their staff because it's the right thing, but also protecting their operational capability because they need to keep operating and survive even in a downgraded economic activity. Yeah, and that approach will differ depending on the type of role we're talking about. So if someone's in a unique senior role that requires them to be on site, then they need to come in and just protect them as best you can. If you've got several people doing some kind of business critical role, but you might need a little bit less of it, you just have a rota effectively. People come in a day or 2 days a week and do the rest remotely if they can. Yeah, that concept of rota is interesting. So we have an operation in Singapore, and part of the Singapore government's guidance was either lock down your office or go on a rotated staff model. So people were in for 3 or 5 days, and then another team came in, and that's continued for some time. But is that staggering of start times, shift work, rostered work? Is that still common? I don't think it's common yet, just from the conversations I've been having. But certainly businesses who can't have staff working from home for operational reasons are giving that serious thought,
because it's not a perfect world, but it's a better world than they might otherwise have to live in. So,
yeah, absolutely. So I guess there are countries where that has become the norm. I think perhaps here in the UK that will become more of a consideration as we dig into the long term impact of this. And there is definitely a sense that right now we're dealing with the impact, the novelty, the immediate challenge of moving to a predominantly home-based workforce. 3 or 4 or 6 weeks down the line, we're going to have to reinvent our business models to make sure that works in the long term.
Yeah.
Let's talk about home working. I mean, as I said earlier, you can't move on social media without some guidance for home working. From the lawyer's perspective, what are the sort of questions that you're getting asked about home working?
So they range significantly from normal mundane day-to-day stuff, like we haven't had people working from home before, and do we need to do workstation and risk assessments for them? What other things do we need to consider, bearing in mind that they might feel a bit more isolated or have less contact with people? Should we be doing proactive things to make sure they still feel part of a team? And there's sort of legal, and there's just obviously an employee relations aspect to that as well. The big question I think that's going to come up more and more in the next few days, the next week or so, is as people get used to schools and nurseries and universities shutting, how in practice does an employer give an employee the flexibility to manage childcare arrangements, but it also ensure they're delivering what they need to for the business? That is a very tricky thing. So that's quite a different question from, for example, what we were being asked a week ago was, I've got an employee who does not fall within self-isolation in accordance with government guidance, but they just don't want to come in. They're really worried about it. Do I have to pay them? So, and the starting point in those circumstances is probably not, but you want to be pragmatic about it, and let's have a chat about those specific circumstances. Here, this is going to be a much more wide-ranging thing. The reality is people are going to have young children at home and are not necessarily going to be able to focus fully on their work. So how do you deal with that? And that will depend on their domestic arrangements as well, whether they're sharing childcare, they can, send their children to family members, etc. But do you say, well, effectively, we only think you're going to be able to deliver 3 days a week now based on what you've told us? We're going to, we need to agree to go down to 3 days a week. Do you just operate in an environment of trust and just keep it under review and say, okay, we're happy for you to carry on working in your existing terms, but let's keep reviewing it and let's see what's working? So employers are really worried about that because they've taken an immediate hit on productivity as people just get used to working from home, and they might now see another hit where people are working from home but are definitely not fully focused on the job and can't be.
Yeah, it's interesting. There's certainly in the leadership circles where I have conversations, particularly in the legal industry, but I think this is wider. There is a dialogue which has moved from what do we expect from our employees generally to how do I get 5 hours of deep productive work out of someone in a 24-hour period, and that's in a supportive way. What can we do to be as flexible as possible to allow our staff to pick and choose when they do what they do? Because it's very easy from a media perspective to look at this as we need to squeeze as much productivity out of people while they're putting their feet up at home. That's not the reality of most businesses. Most businesses are staffed by very motivated, talented people who the last thing they want to do is put their feet up. What they're actually dealing with is genuine frustration around their ability to do good work and have the impact that they want to do. So I think that's an interesting shift in terms of flexible working. It's not just about geography, it's about time. And I wonder how that will relate in the medium term to, for example, our legal obligations under Working Time Directive and things like that. I think some really interesting questions there that presumably no one has an answer to at the moment.
No, you're right. And I think, I'll come back to the law in a moment, but just from purely sort of practical and human perspective, it's all about proper two-way communication between employer and employees. So we're seeing employees being very creative at home in terms of how they manage their children being there. So you might have two people, so both parents at home, both working full time. So they effectively do 3 hours on and 3 hours off. And as long as that works for the employer and both employers get what they need out of that, that's a really clever way of doing it as well. So, and there are lots of I suspect there'll be more innovative arrangements that along those lines, which will come out as people just work out what it means for them. From a legal perspective, I think actually the main concern, and maybe this is perhaps unrelated to childcare, is you might have a bunch of employees who are working from home, and because they don't have the normal structure to their day and the normal rigors around taking breaks or coming in at a certain time, they are literally on it from the moment they wake up to the moment they go to bed. There could be working time issues there. Are they working longer than they should be? And how are you monitoring that effectively? So again, that's a little bit about knowing your workers. You may know of individuals within your businesses who are left to their own devices would just be workaholics.
Well, I think workaholics is one mental health risk, but I think there is a whole plethora of mental health risks that there is genuine concern about, particularly if what we see is an enforced period of home working that might last up to 3 months, possibly longer. Yeah,
absolutely. And interesting. So we, as a general trend for employment lawyers in the last few years, we have seen more requests for home working policies. And what does that mean in practice for employers? And there's a real health and safety and real duty of care element to that, and mental health, obviously a really big topic anyway. Wellness at work, we've seen lots of initiatives around that in the last couple of years. But making sure people don't feel isolated and do feel part of a team. And also other practical things, such as people are going to be working at home on perhaps pretty sensitive, commercially sensitive stuff. So have they got the right, is the employer comfortable that they're working in a secure place, that they can take a private call if they need to, and it's not on the dining room table where all the the financial documents or the accounts are out for everyone to see. It's stuff like that you only start thinking about when you start operating on a home working basis, across the business.
Well, I think there's no doubt we'll learn a lot of lessons here, and home working was only ever set to become a more prevalent part of the employer landscape. And here's an opportunity to really stress test that, and there will be regulatory issues, mental health issues, leadership issues that come out of that. I was interested in what you said about two-way communication, because clearly there's a lot of talk about what's the right thing to do, what's the wrong thing to do, and I suspect beyond doing your best, common sense, the answer is there's no right or wrong answers at the moment. Those will emerge. So that's what you do, but how you do it right now, I guess, is as important as what you do.
Yes, I think that's right. My sense from my conversations with employers in the recent few days has been that they are actually really sensitive to the fact that this is an uncertain time for everyone. So obviously an uncertain time for business, but there's a lot of, understandably, a lot of concern, a little bit of media hysteria around this as well, and people are genuinely starting to think, well, is my job still going to be there in a month or 2 months' time? No one's really talking to me about it. So I think you're right. So where people are needing childcare arrangements and needing to be flexible, I think actually employers at the moment are pretty amenable to agreeing to that on the basis that it's kept under review. Because, as long as people are just doing what they need to do and being productive, and that is showing in however a business measures that kind of thing, then my sense is most employers are being pretty relaxed about it at the moment.
But your sense is also that you can't over-communicate around this. Back to your reassurance point, you can't over-communicate at the moment. There's lots of anxiety out there.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there is a lot of anxiety out there. And businesses don't have the answers, and they're being pretty upfront about that. And I think that is, in a way, that's kind of reassuring in itself. No one's trying to pull the wool over anyone's eyes, but it's kind of, we really need to see how this plays out on a day-by-day basis at the moment. And maybe we'll settle into a pattern in a week or so's time where it becomes a bit more normal and we kind of start planning longer term.
And the price of that ongoing uncertainty is a high level of communication.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Two-way, I guess, as well, because I think, we've certainly seen lots of businesses encouraging their employees to not only talk with each other, but be open about their anxieties and concerns. And as you say, although we may not have the answers to those questions, acknowledging the questions and the importance of the questions is part of the success.
Yeah, and that leadership are thinking about those issues, I think.
Yeah. And in our own business, we've certainly had a number of really useful, practical suggestions come from within the teams and the staff at all levels, which, when you're dealing with, as a business leader, when you're dealing with some fairly chunky issues around the big picture of running the business, it's easy to overlook some of the things that are actually very acute sensitivities for people and easy for us to deal with, provided they're brought to light and we can give them proper attention.
Agreed.
Okay, so you're in the work environment. That you may be part of core staff in the office. You may be at home. Somebody has a suspected or confirmed case of COVID-19.
Yep.
What should employers be doing or not doing in that situation?
I think the immediate thing is not to have a knee-jerk reaction. So the problem's been identified, has been, that immediate individual issue has been, dealt with. So the person concerned is sent home, told to self-isolate in accordance with government guidance. So you take that out of the workplace. The next question is, should we just go into lockdown? Should we shut down the office? Should we tell everyone else who's in the office what's happened? And I think you've got to be really, really careful about that. So the first step I would always suggest is, speak to Public Health England, because they may come out and do assessments. They'll be able to give you some immediate guidance on what you might need to do in terms of maybe a deep clean, if that's appropriate, or maybe shutting down part of your building. I've got one client who has had to shut down one building, but they can all move to another one, so it's fine. But just, taking a step back and taking a deep breath, just because someone has a suspected or confirmed case in the workplace does not necessarily mean you need to kind of go into immediate shutdown mode. And I guess the other issue is also being sensitive to the privacy and data protection issues concerning that individual. Is it really ever going to be necessary for you to say, person X has been sent home for this reason, this is what we're doing about it? Probably rare. You may have circumstances where a certain individual has been in close contact with certain team members where, it is appropriate to let them know that the issue has arisen, so they can go and take their own judgment on how they want to deal with it and whether they should be self-isolating or getting themselves checked. So very, very tricky, that, because you're effectively constantly balancing with a lot of these things, privacy and data protection versus your wider duty to the workforce to make sure everyone's kept safe and informed.
So some other practical questions, which I know have come up in our own client base. What happens if you've got someone at home, they can't work, they are sick? Are you paying them sick pay in that situation? And what's the position with the government's advice that they're potentially going to reimburse sick pay for the first 14 days to employers? Yeah. So there's a lot of there's been a lot of confusion around that, and I still think we could do with a little bit more clarity at government level about it, what it means practically. So basic principle: if someone is off sick at home and they are not fit to work, they're entitled to sick pay. So that's statutory sick pay as a starting point. Some employers will obviously have enhanced company sick pay policies, and they should just apply those as they would. There may be some discretion, for example. Some organisations guarantee a certain amount of full pay, then a period of half pay. Some it's a question of discretion, and you need to again exercise that sensitively and pragmatically, I would say. There's also a category of people who are otherwise fit to work, but they are self-isolating as a precaution, or they are caring for someone who is self-isolating, and they say their job can't be done from home. The new legislation that's coming deals with those people specifically and says they are still entitled to statutory sick pay, because although they can work, they're not able to actually come in and do their job for those reasons. And again, there's a broader public health issue there. So, okay, so more guidance required, but that's certainly a helpful steer. The other situation, there's a lot of talk about travel. So I think I'm right in saying any non-essential travel, any international travel outside the UK, pretty much not the right thing to do at the moment. That's the government guidance.
Agreed.
That's what businesses are doing.
Yep.
What about the situation where you've got someone stranded overseas, either from a business perspective, they were on a trip and they're stuck wherever they may be, or they've they've been on holiday and they've got stuck, or they've gone to see a relative and got stuck. What's the best approach in relation to those people?
Well, I get that those two circumstances are quite different from a legal perspective. So I think if you've got someone who is stranded on a business trip, firstly, I guess they're likely to be in a category of person that can continue to work remotely from wherever they are. But I do think, although there's no clear rights either way under law, I do think there is at least certain moral sense that employers have, I think, to try and repatriate that person as soon as possible. Not least because, again, it's part of mental health and issues like that, but there's also an ongoing cost of having someone in another country, perhaps in a hotel, dealing with their subsistence, dealing with, trying to get emergency flights home. So often, both from a business and a human perspective, getting them back as quickly as possible is the right thing to do. And typically, they would continue to be paid full pay.
Okay, that's helpful. And so on the topic of pay, because I think that's obviously close to the heart of many of the listeners to this podcast, whether they're paying or receiving. Yeah. Lots of talk about flexible, medium-term responses to where we are, and clearly industry-specific complexities in that as well. Yeah. But as a general theme, there's talk about reducing hours and pay. There's talk about forcing people to take holiday or buy additional holiday, unpaid sabbaticals, whatever it may be. At a generic level, presumably it's not as straightforward as just deciding that's the right thing for the business and then expecting everyone to fall into line. Yeah, quite right, Matt. The core legal principle is if you are asking someone to take unpaid leave, if you are asking them effectively to reduce their hours and reduce their pay accordingly, to effectively go part-time, unless you have an existing contractual right to do that, either expressed in the contract or maybe implied through customer practice, which would be pretty rare, I think, for most of our client base, then you can't do it unless you get employee consent or some other, or take steps after trying to get that consent to kind of effectively dismiss and re-engage them. So it's fraught with legal risk, that kind of thing. What I am seeing at a practical level is actually a lot of employees are being quite pragmatic about it. So where they are being asked to perhaps reduce their pay and hours, it's all around the messaging from an employer's perspective. What we're hearing anecdotally is if employees feel that they're all in it together, so everyone is taking a hit in some form or another, right from the top to the bottom of that organisation, they're more likely to say, okay, well, I feel I need to do my bit, and this is a kind of least worst option if the alternative is I might not have a job in a month or so's time. So that's the basis, I think, on which most employers are approaching it. But as a starting point, you do need employee consent. Right, and so that can be legal, or it could just be from, as you say, everyone feeling in the same boat, which comes back to the communication and the transparency that we were talking about earlier. And certainly, I've had some really interesting discussions recently with employers who are saying, well, what if we just impose it? What's the legal risk there? So we're just gonna write to everyone and say, as of Monday, you're all working at 80% and get 80% pay. That is obviously much less likely to get employee buy-in. You're going to have immediate employee relations issues there, which will then take a lot of management time to deal with that fallout when you're probably trying to focus on more immediate crisis management and business planning. But just from a legal perspective, you could have there's a high possibility of claims there. People may just resign and say, well, you've breached my contract, I'm off, and I'm going to bring unfair dismissal claims. Employees may actually just sit tight and say, well, okay, I'll work 80%, but I'll work under protest, and I'm going to reserve the right to claim my back pay at a later date for breach of contract or deductions for wages. There's various legal mechanisms to do that. So, my view, that is a pretty high risk strategy, and there is little harm in trying to get consent first. So, not advisable. Okay, that's clear. We like a clear lawyer's answer. Two quick questions on following up from that. So the first one is, from a legal perspective, is there an obligation, a duty to treat everybody the same, or can you treat different categories of staff differently? So the answer is you can treat different categories of staff differently if there's a business need to, say, for example, reduce
time and pay in one area of the business, which is perhaps more reliant on a certain level of productivity or a certain type of task, which is just no longer there. So people in that group, we just need less of you. So we're going to work out how we manage a reduced demand effectively. The only legal consideration is ensuring that you're not somehow discriminating, on basis of protected characteristics. So, that may be, for example, certain type of role or certain area within the business may have predominantly male or female employees within it. So if you're treating them all the same, ostensibly, there's no discrimination, but there could be some kind of indirect discrimination there. And then you just need a really good business reason to justify why you're doing that.
Okay, so it sounds like as we get into those more complex reaction scenarios, medium-term scenarios, that's when to start thinking about getting some advice on how to navigate that tactically and from a legal perspective. So the second question I had was, if you find yourself as a business in a position where you do need to lay some people off.
Yeah.
We've seen in other countries, Italy's been an example of this, where the government's got involved and changed some of the law around that. As things stand today, Thursday the 19th of March, is all of the law about redundancy, dismissal, discrimination exactly as it was 3 months ago?
Yes. There's a short answer to that. And I've had some discussions with some fairly sort of frustrated HR directors, particularly those who may have a Europe-wide remit, where state intervention in Europe is a much more advanced stage than it is here. So, the short answer is if you've got to make redundancies, you need to do it in the way you would ordinarily have done it. There are no shortcuts, really.
Okay, that's good and clear as well. We said earlier we'd come back to the question of culture and purpose. Are you seeing anything particularly interesting or creative around how organisations are trying to preserve those important features, or are we in uncharted waters and waiting to see what comes out?
Yeah, it's a good question, Matt. I think people are learning from each other. I mean, you mentioned there's loads of activity on social media where organisations or individuals are sharing how they're managing the first few days, because it is the first few days for a lot of businesses. I do think actually this is a real acid test for businesses who pride themselves on a sense of purpose and culture and authenticity. It's about walking the walk now. If they've held themselves out as that and they are seen by their workforce as staying true to those values, then I think if there are tougher decisions to be made down the line about reduced pay, certainly those will be easier discussions to have. But yeah, I mean, all sorts of things. So people sort of sharing pictures of themselves at their workstations, bring a pet to a video con, that kind of thing. It's all kind of like sort of fairly light-hearted but good things. People even sort of arranging to have lunch at their desks together so everyone's on the call and just chatting. Just basic human stuff like that can still be done, just needs a little bit of effort.
Yeah, we've definitely seen a lot of very positive responses to that, and what's most heartening is it's come within, from within, and that's I think to your point, now culture is being tested in anger, and it will be interesting to see who has got that genuine and authentic culture. Looking to the long term, I mean, clearly we are in the fog at the moment, so it's very difficult to know what that long term looks like. I guess two questions for you. The first one is, what do we think will happen to the workplace after this? I mean, will we ever go back to the office, or is this the start of home working on a mass scale? And secondly, just how do you think organisations will change and pivot their people strategies after Corona 2019?
Yeah, well, I think again, interestingly, because obviously, Matt, we've been talking as an organisation about the future of work and business reimagined for some time through Zebra Project and things like that. And again, it's a sense that there's been a lot of really interesting talk and discussion, but if there's ever a time to implement some of that, this will be it. So absolutely, we're at as we stand today on the 19th of March, everyone's feeling at a relatively low ebb, but thinking around, this is only temporary. However difficult it might seem at the moment, this is only likely to be temporary. And actually, there's a limit on how much more society can be restricted, I think. So if you look at it in that sense, and you're starting to think, well, we eventually we're going to come out to the other side, this is a real opportunity now to completely change the way that certain organizations want to work. And organizations that have been talking about it and have been tinkering around the edges, what a great chance to say, well, we've learned X and Y from this mass working from home policy. Why don't we say, actually, it's absolutely fine for everyone to work from home one day a week, or just to be more flexible in how they do things. And they might actually think this is a great chance to stress test that, I guess. So.
And right at the centre of that opportunity is open, transparent and authentic dialogue between employer and employee.
Yeah, absolutely. And you see, we've seen it over a long period of time, but that kind of really, really traditional sense of an employment relationship, that it's sort of master and servant, and employees are paid and they come in and they do what they're told without much kind of give or take, that we just don't live in that world anymore. And actually, employees having a greater sense of responsibility for their own time and feeling empowered to manage their time and their location in a certain way, where perhaps they might have been able to do so previously, but not to the same degree, I think opens up a whole load of opportunities around staff engagement, around retention, actually around productivity, because people who are empowered to work in that way in the right environment, I suspect, are happier and therefore do better work.
Dom, fantastic conversation. Employment lawyers are in high demand, so I'm going to let you get back to supporting the innovators and entrepreneurs that you look after navigate their way through this. I suspect we will be back in a number of weeks with a whole set of different questions.
Sure.
But for now, that's hugely helpful. Thanks, Dom Holmes.
Thanks very much, Matt.